First off, I want to welcome to you all, and we're really pleased to thank you in person for your support of MCL and to share with you this lovely venue, good food and company, and an interesting talk about the shared history of MCL and the Marin Art and Garden Center, who have reached the venerable ages of 85 and 75 years, respectively. Yay! I'd also like to acknowledge MCL's hardworking and dedicated board, and some of them are here. If you are an MCL board member, please raise your hand. All right. And if you have any questions on MCL's current work or have ideas for us, please see a board member. They'd love to meet with you. And I also see some former MCL past presidents. And if you have been president of MCL, would you please raise your hand? I see many. All right. And being president, I know what it takes, and it's a real commitment, and then you also have a lot of reward from it. There's a former president I want to give a special shout out to, and that is Bob Roth. And he's sitting over there with my good friend Bob Miller. Bob has been an important part of MCL's history. He wrote the newsletter for many years, past president, as you heard. And Bob has been very active in tracking state water issues with Ted Wellman. And you know MCL gives out the Ted Wellman Water Award. So these two gentlemen have had a profound influence. And my understanding is that you helped stop the peripheral canal. We owe you a debt. Thank you. I also would like to thank our professional staff, Holly Smith, who is our office and events manager right there, who pulled the food and the lovely decorations together, and Kirsten Nolan, our communications coordinator right here, with how artistic everything looks, but did the invitations and the program and is a big part of MCL's wonderful professional staff. We couldn't do it without you guys, so thank you. And Vicki Nichols, are you here? Vicki Nichols is a director, chair of our organizational development committee, active in MCL's event planning, including this event. And she puts together the most outrageous cheese platters. Thank you, Vicki. You'll also see a camera person set up here today. We invited CM, Community Center of Marin, to film Carol's talk today. This will be posted on the MCL website as an historical archive. Damian Prince Brown is our photographer, and we appreciate you being here, Damian. Thank you so much. So this is MCL's 85th anniversary, and very near to the exact day when MCL was formed, November 6th, 1934. Honoring our founders and the important environmental conservation work this organization has championed for the last 85 years is reason enough to celebrate. But we have more to celebrate today, and I think our founders would be very pleased with MCL's work. Here are two very recent examples. At our October board meeting, just this past week, we voted to support the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority to support and address Marin's need for coordinated action to reduce wildfire risk, support efforts of fire agencies, municipal and county governments, and Fire Safe Marin to start tackling the big issues facing us as a county. This initiative creates a new Joint Powers Agreement, JPA, to oversee and implement the work with oversight mechanisms in place. MCL supports this because we believe it is a well-planned approach to defending not just homes and evacuation routes, but public lands. Funds will be allocated for more removal of invasive plants and the restoration of native plant communities. And you'll find more information on our website and in MCL's upcoming newsletter. And I want to acknowledge Nona Dennis, our editor, who has practically single-handed crafts our newsletter every other month. And Nona, here's to you. At the same board meeting this past week, MCL agreed to support the Trust for Public Lands efforts to restore the 157-acre San Geronimo property. Trust for Public Land, TPL, is working with the community on multiple plans for the property, a revisioning effort. If you haven't been there, please go. It's inspiring to see this land and think about what it could be. One proposed plan is to restore a section, this section of the Lagunitas Creek watershed so that baby central coastal coho salmon can survive winter storms. And you can call them fry and juvenile fish, or you can just say baby salmon. But it's important, it's an opportunity that we don't want to miss, and these kind of opportunities don't come that often. Lagunitas Creek is the southernmost run of this federally listed species. It's endangered. It supplies 20% of the population of this species, and San Geronimo Creek, flowing through the old golf course property, supplies 40% of the Lagunitas Creek population. So we are very pleased to support this. MCO will also work hard to defeat the March 2020 ballot initiative that would restrict the property to being only a golf course. Rather, we support this wholehearted community visioning. Please talk with our board members about other important work we're engaged in, more renewable energy use, the support of Marin farms to keep a critical mass of farms in place so that we can provide local food and encourage our farmers to continue with their best management practices for environmental protection. I'd also like to thank today Magic. And you're going to hear from the executive director of Magic in just a moment. Number one, they've provided this lovely venue with this incredible international and Northern California art display, and it's pretty breathtaking in its scope. Svetlana is the gallery sitter right here, and if you have questions after the event, please don't hesitate to ask for her guidance. You'll also notice that after the event, our dedicated staff and volunteers will be quickly cleaning things up because there's a wedding happening shortly after we're through. But you know, feel free while we're doing that to enjoy the art in case you didn't have a chance before. So at this point, I would like to also mention our speaker, not the least, Carol Roland-Nawi. You'll see on the program her professional credits. She has become much more involved in gardens since she retired, even starting a garden on her balcony that her 4-year-old grandson is now harvesting lettuce from, right, Carol?
Yes, well, his garden.
His garden, and he's harvesting lettuce. All right, it's his garden. So she's able, now that she isn't the state's historic preservation officer, she can put her time and energy into gardening and really getting involved with landscapes where her true passion lies. And I'd like to also welcome Antonio Adizio, who is Executive Director of Magic. And Antonio, can we impose upon you to come up for a minute and tell us a little something about Magic at this wonderful crossroads of both our organizations?
Well, thank you, Linda, and all the staff and board members who have come together to make this event such a special occasion for both our organizations. On behalf of the trustees of the Marin Garden Center, I want to say how pleased we are to have you here and to help you honor the people who keep your organization going, because we know just how important that is. Marin Garden Center shares a DNA with Marin Conservation League for sure, and Carol will be talking a little bit more about that. we were very fortunate to have her come on board to help us look into the history of this place about 2 years ago. And her research confirmed kind of a hunch that we had, that it was a very important place indeed. People have loved to be here for the 75 years that it has been preserved and open to the public. It was the home of the Marin County Fair until 1970, which some people remember as children coming here to go on rides and see art exhibits. It has served many purposes over the years as a gathering place for people to celebrate important moments, weddings being certainly one of them, as a place to come and enjoy in a kind of quiet way, these beautiful big trees, rolling lawns, the whole environment of this 11 acres. And more recently, we've come around to doing a more active program, engaging people with our mission, which has to do with understanding and sharing in the arts, gardens, and the natural environment. And that one comes last because it's easier to say that way, but I think that is the thing that holds it all together, that the place where we are is the thing that we're celebrating and wanting to learn more about. And so I think while we're keeping Caroline Livermore's legacy alive as a place of gathering, as a place of learning and sharing, you are keeping her activist side alive and saving the context for this place and for what we all kind of take for granted living here in this beautiful part of the world. So I think that the synergy, as I said, is very palpable, and I hope there'll be other ways we can collaborate in the future. I want to thank Nona Dennis, who introduced me to all of your good work, by the way, and who gallantly joined me last year when we put together a conference on the history of Marin County, and I will never forget the date the Golden Gate Bridge was built, thanks to Nona. But for someone who comes personally from New York, it was all new and fascinating information, and just reinforced how lucky we are to have this amazing place where we all live. So thank you for what you do. I want to say a word about this building where we are, and also just to follow on Linda's remarks about this exhibit. This building was the first building that was purpose-built for the center. The center had been a private estate. It was the last piece of an estate. The house, big house, burned in the 1930s, and it was on the market to be subdivided when Caroline Livermore and her friends gathered to purchase it, which Carol will tell you more about. When they did that, they brought together a number of neighborhood groups who were already doing great work in the arts. The Roth Valley Players have already converted the estate barn into their theater, where they have been putting on plays for almost 90 years now. And this building was constructed for the Marin Society of Artists, which was an existing group of artists who liked to get together and show each other their work. But it has a real architectural pedigree. It was designed by Gardner Daly, pretty noted Bay Area regional architect. And it was built as a gallery, which is why it has no windows and why it's such a great space for art. MSA was actually here until 2015 when they moved to a bigger place in San Rafael. And at that point we renovated the building. We took up the old cracked tile that was turned out full of asbestos. We took down the ceiling that was blocking the view of this lovely the struts and ceiling we have. And bingo, we had again a wonderful place for art. So we've been hosting ever since extremely varied series of art exhibitions. They always have something to do, though, with the natural environment. That's the connection that we're trying to make. And for me, botanical illustration is the ultimate example of that, because it's really where science and art come together, and it's about close observation of nature. And this show is an international show, as Linda said. It's juried. It happens every year. This is the first time it's been on the West Coast, so we're quite honored to have it here. And I was saying before lunch that it was so much, it's like Christmas, and the packages started coming in from Brazil and Russia and the UK. And it was really exciting. So this is something very special, so please do take a little time to enjoy it. And I hope you will come back for the program in December, which is a show and sale by a group of local artists whom probably many of you know. They have been very generously contributing their time and talents to a number of nonprofits here in Marin County. The last 2 years, One Tam was the beneficiary, and this year they decided to do something for the Marin Art Garden Center and chose as a theme none other than the legacy of Caroline Livermore. So it's another chance to raise a glass to her and to her vision and to celebrate this beautiful place where we all live. So we hope we'll see you again. If you have time before you go home, take a walk in the garden. That's another thing to do before you leave, and please come back. Linda, thank you so much for your generosity in inviting me up here, and best wishes for another successful season of advocating.
And same to you. Please join me in welcoming Carol Roland-Nawi.
Well, I am delighted to be here today. As Antonia said, this started out as a project to research and develop the history for the center and figure out if indeed it was an important place. And it just turned out to be a delightful, kind of long-term, ongoing project in many ways. And it's a place I've really come to really enjoy and to be very, very fond of. I'll just start here and I will probably sit down sometime not too long from now. I'm not good at standing a half hour or 45 minutes anymore, but anyway. Marin County, as I'm sure all of you know, has always been a leader in the environmental movement. According to the Greenbelt Alliance, it has the highest percentage of protected land in the Bay Area, with nearly 58% of the county's 333,000 acres protected in some way from unregulated development. It boasts 6 national parks and recreation areas, 6 state parks plus Angel Island just offshore, and 5 underwater marine reserves. What I'm going to talk about today is going to center on the very specific history of the Marin Art and Garden Center, MAGIC. But I think it's extremely important in understanding this place to understand its connection to this larger environmental history of Marin County and the many organizations, not the least of which is the Marin Conservation League, and the ties in the history between these organizations. There's very direct linkage between the Art and Garden Center and the Conservation League. It's linked in 3, I think, very significant ways. First of all, there are the founders. The center and the league were founded by the same 4 prominent Marin women. What we focus on these leaders of those, the driving forces behind the 2 organizations, I would say that although, as we'll see, Marin County grew enormously in the 20th century, it remained to some extent a socially small place. And so, in addition to the leaders of the movement, many of the women who were involved in the garden clubs of Marin, in the Art and Garden Center, and in the league overlapped with one another. So that there was sort of if you will, a convergence of interest and personnel back and forth among these groups. The League and the Center are also linked because they were both responses to the growth of Marin County and the transformation that brought about in its landscape and its environment in the mid-20th century. And philosophically, they were linked, or maybe we could say they were slightly different faces of a growing awareness, again in the mid-20th and later 20th century, on the importance of the natural environment, of open space, and of community. Although Marin County, we'll start here. Right, forward. There we go. All right. Although Marin County is only 8 miles from San Francisco, Marin, despite this geographic proximity, Marin and San Francisco were from the very beginning of their Anglo history extremely different than one another. While San Francisco was the largest city in the western United States in both the 19th and early 20th century, and it continues to be one of the country's major urban areas, Marin in the 19th and early 20th centuries was a very, very different place from the city. It was sparsely populated, it was bucolic and agricultural. It was an area characterized by dairying in the north and the west, and by large estates in the southern portion of the county, many of which were seasonally occupied by wealthy San Franciscans. To give you a sort of numerical measure of this difference, in 1900, San Francisco, with its very small geographic area, was home to 340,000 people living densely in that city. In Marin, a mere 15,000 people occupied the entire over 300,000 acres of the county. You can see sort of let me adjust this, pull this down. You can see what this bucolic early environment of Marin was like in these two, a photograph on the left side done in about 1882, and in this lovely plein air painting, which was executed in the late 20s or early 1930s. If you look at the interesting thing is whether by intent or serendipitously, both of these are pictured from almost exactly the same vantage point, which is just up the hill from behind where the Art and Garden Center is today. You can see in the photograph how sparsely populated and open Ross Valley is. And again, even in the 1920s and 30s, when we see a little more in the way of the built environment here, it's still a very, very bucolic environment. Garden Center property was originally part of the Spanish land grant, Rancho Punta de Puente, which stretched from here in the Ross Valley all the way to where the prison is today and the whole area around the ferry building. It was a Spanish land grant and was one of the very first of these large palatial estates in southern Marin. It was settled in 1864 by the Warrens, who were a pioneer Marin family, and purchased in 1882 by a commission merchant from San Francisco named Jonathan Kittle. And this very proper Victorian gentleman you see here in the center of the screen is Jonathan Kittle. And these are the primary buildings that were here when the Kittles owned the estate. In a sense, although the house is rather palatial, their imprint on the 10-acre estate was relatively small in terms of the footprint that they put here. As I say, this is the Kittle Mansion, this very interesting building, which if you walk around at all, you will immediately see, and which is still here, is the octagonal. This octagonal building originally served the Kittles as a well house to protect the large supply of the estate. There was a barn here, slightly up the hill, which is now the home of the playhouse of the Ross Valley Players. The Kittles used it initially to house their horses, and in the 1920s they converted it to a garage to house their automobiles. And on this side you see this kind of meandering, what was a road and is now a footpath, which is the entrance now to the garden and was the original road from Sir Francis Drake, Sir Francis Drake into the Kittle estate. Beginning towards the early turn of the 20th century, this lovely bucolic environment of Marin County began to change to some extent. One of the first causes for change was, of course, the 1906 earthquake and fire in San Francisco, which pushed many people, particularly some wealthier people in San Francisco, to move north to a less dense environment. The second major factor before World War II that promoted growth in the county was, of course, the completion in 1936 of the Golden Gate Bridge, one of the largest and probably one of the most famous of the Works Progress Administration projects that were initiated during the Depression under the Roosevelt administration. But nothing changed southern Marin County as much as the rush to the suburbs that followed World War II. What this rush was both a national phenomenon and very much a phenomenon within the Bay Area. What it brought about here was that many of the large states began to be subdivided, as did many agricultural properties, and replaced these palatial places were replaced by tracts of much smaller houses. The end of the war, in addition to changing the way the patterns of settlement are in the Bay Area, the end of the war was also accompanied, again throughout the country, by a kind of a change in the roles of women. I think we could say that Rosie the Riveter took off her workshop and her bandana, and she traded it in on an apron, all-electric kitchen and a station wagon to drive the kids. I think also this advertisement here. I should say, I'm sorry, I skipped over this. Talking about the growth of the county right after the war, you see here it's a bit faded, but this is a tract map with a proposal to subdivide where you're currently sitting and to divide it into small housing lots, both here in what is now the garden and in the surrounding area. I think nothing sort of embodies this image of the 1950s and sort of embodies what happened here in terms of suburbanization. This is an ad by the Eichler Development Company. Eichler built a number of suburbs and tracts here of individual family homes. And if you were white and middle class, this was really put forward as the ideal of life in the 1950s. The single nuclear family, happily living in their single occupancy house, and with a small backyard, which had been transformed from the function of backyards in earlier periods of housing, where it was often a work area, a garden, a place for a vegetable garden, a place where you kept the chickens, had a much more utilitarian function. In the 1950s, the ideal of the yard became one of a recreational space, an entertainment space, a place of family togetherness. But not everybody loved the idea of suburbanization. There were some people, somewhat foresighted, who saw some of the problems that came along with suburbanization: traffic, congestion, roadside commercialism, and a loss of open space. Among the first to sound that alarm in Marin County were the Marin Garden Clubs. The Garden Clubs was a national movement which existed all over the country, was very popular here in Marin, and its emphasis was both initially horticultural and then that expanded to become very much an environmental program. And so what you see here is the Marin Garden Club, founded in 1931, and all four of the founders of the League and of the Marin Art and Garden Center are among these 7 women. And I have to thank Fran for helping me to identify who is who here. On the extreme left side, you see Portia Forbes, who was one of the people very much involved in the founding of these organizations. On the other end, on the right, you see Helen Van helped, who I understand is getting some research now and putting together some new information about her. The woman in the black hat near the dog is, I believe, Carolyn Livermore, and next to her on your right was Sephra Evers. And hopefully we got this right, where they are. The woman in the white hat here is, again, someone we'll talk about in a minute, Gladys Smith, who was a very active person here in one of the gardens, is named after. Don't be fooled when you see these women by their hats and white gloves and decorously crossed ankles. This was a group of women who were very determined political activists. They knew what they wanted and they knew how to go after it. They were also among the very first to foresee the potential for loss in Marin Valley, or in Marin County. And they had previously, from the Garden Club, these four women organized the League, and then subsequently, right after the war, brought together the Art and Garden Center. They banded together, when they banded together to form the League, the very first thing that they did was they hired a professional planner, something that was almost an entirely new profession at the time. And they assigned him to survey the entire county and identify all the land that should be kept in open space. They really thought large. And then armed with maps and blueprints, they took that paper and they lobbied city and county governments. They raised public awareness. They held events to encourage people to become very aware of the environment and what might be lost in Marin County forever. One of the first events that the League sponsored after it was founded was a car caravan to the shore of Tomales Bay and out to the beaches to make people aware how all this could be bought up, developed, and closed off to the public. And in some cases, they even used their own money to acquire land for parks, habitat, and accessible beaches. The record of their achievements is very impressive, and only a very tiny portion of that is represented here. That Nona was saying as we were eating lunch that the first years of the League were very often dedicated to land acquisition, and these are some of the very important early land acquisitions: Tomales Bay, Samuel P. Taylor State Park, and Angel Island. And there Carolyn's evidence was so significant and important in saving Angel Island from development that the highest peak on the island is named in her honor. Their record of achievement was extremely impressive. So it's within this context of saving open space and conserving land that we come to understand the relationship of the Art and Garden Center to the broader environmental perspective. By 1945, the Kill Estate was one of the very few large pieces of land that was even left in the Roth Valley. With only the barn and the octagonal building still standing, the mansion itself burned in the 1930s, and the Kills, for whatever reasons, never replaced it. The property here, you can see in the center here, sort of the open space where the well house was, and you can see kind of a little bit up where the barn was located, and you see very prominently the road that comes in here. The rest of the 10-acre property was naturalized woodland and grasslands. So it really was a very naturalized landscape here. And as I say, it's one of the only ones left in the heart of Roth. And not only was it one of the only ones left, the Kittles were very, very anxious to take advantage of the real estate boom of the post-war years. They wanted to sell this place. And once again, but even before they actually came together to found these four women to found the center and create a place in the community. The women's garden clubs had begun to think about the idea of having a garden center. At first, the idea was that it would be very horticulturally oriented, and then that was kind of expanded into the idea that it should also be a place for the arts and sort of if you will, kind of a community center where you could bring together existing organizations and use it as a place for community activities. It was also, they also drew on the idea from the national women's garden movement. The idea that was put forward during, even before the war ended, of creating gardens as memorial places for those who had died in the war. And that was later expanded to take in those who had made major contributions to their local communities. So there was this sort of national idea out there in the garden club movement to create these kinds of centers. And closer to home, the Marin women were inspired by this place, the Allied Arts Center of Menlo Park, which had been developed there in the 1920s through a very generous philanthropic gift of a wealthy couple in the peninsula area. And it was conceived as an idea of a place where local art and artists could both work in studio environments and also sell their good and market their goods. And it was conceived as a place that would have a lovely garden. It would be very pastoral and very beautiful. The Allied Arts organization is still there. About 20 years ago, it was restored. It's a lovely place. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. If you have a chance to visit, it's really quite lovely. You can also have lunch there in the garden. So aware of these models around them, again, these women who were very active in the garden club, very active, had helped to form the league, came together, and Carolyn Livermore once more took the lead. She knew about the Kittle property, she knew the Kittles wanted to sell, so she took herself to the bank. She took out the money to pay for the property, and she purchased the estate before developers could get there. Lest we think she was too generous, she also made very, very sure from the very beginning that her loan, that her forthcomingness was in the form of a loan to the center and that it would be paid back to her eventually, as it was. Much like the art in gardens, this is Carolyn Livermore. This is a portrait photograph of her taken sometime between the mid-60s and the late 60s, just kind of before she died, when she was chair of the board of the Marin Art and Garden Center. And the building you see on the left here is the Livermore Pavilion. I don't know if any of you walked around the property beforehand or been here before. It's one of the major buildings behind where the office is, and it has served many, many purposes over the years. The vision of the center was to create, as I say, a place for the arts, theater, dance, visual arts, crafts, where they and horticulture and conservation activities all could have a home at one site. And the idea was that by bringing these groups together, they could best serve their own needs, and they could also help to, by participating in one place, to help facilitate and provides financial support to the center itself while creating a place for people in the community. The goals of the center were, well, as they say, to bring these groups together. And you can see here how these activities, there was an emphasis on the arts. This is a picture in the gallery building originally, and the person here was a very important founder of the center, Jose Moya de la Pino, a Marin resident and a very well-known Bay Area artist. You can also see theater groups, the theater groups that were here, the Marin Garden Club, and the women who were most intensely interested in horticulture, and literally got down on their hands and knees and did a lot of the gardening here. And it was also a place where the League and other conservation organizations could carry out business, do planning, and carry on their work. The center developed primarily between 1945 and 1970. This first period of foundation of the center, the board had several goals. One was to develop programs and events that would bring people to the center, that would service it, and that would provide a community center. They focused on site planning and design, how they would develop the garden and create a place that was a beautiful place that people would want to come, and how they could effect financial stability so that the center was well supported and could continue. Probably one of the first things they did was begin to create events which were both had a big community focus, and at the same time helped to support the center financially. Probably the most important of these in this period from 45 to 70 was the Marin County Fair. For many, many years, it was probably the most popular event that the center carried out. But being Marin County, the fair was not entirely what you might think of as a county fair when that comes to mind. It was a bit short on chickens and pigs, and very largely embodied the interests and the variety of center groups and their activities. There were theatrical presentations, wandering musicians, whimsical crafts and art for sale, horticultural displays, and it was a place where many of the nurseries in Marin and Sonoma and Napa came to display their wares and to help educate people. It was so popular as an event that by 1969, over this, as you can see on this poster, it was a 3-day event usually held in June. It attracted 40,000 visitors, much to the annoyance of the neighbors. Traffic, parking, noise were big problems. And so in 1970, it was decided to move the fair to the Civic Center, which had just been completed, to a purpose-built facility. And one of the things that had to happen was for the center to begin to look at other ways of financially supporting itself. And through this, in the early period of the 50s, a number of auxiliary groups, that there were these founding organizations that had already existed in the community. And then in the 50s, some auxiliary groups came together and formed themselves to provide specific, to undertake specific functions at the center. You see here some of these groups that, and some of the annual events that they began to sponsor that were very important at the center. One of the most popular was a fall chrysanthemum show. They gave classes on flower arranging. There were floral competitions that you can see being carried out over here on the left side. And this slide in the center is of the Decorations Guild. These are women who came together to create floral and horticulturally based decorations, and they then sold those to help support the center. Probably their most important event was the Christmas Green Show, which you see them here making Christmas trees. But in addition to supporting the center, this actually had a conservation objective. Again, drawing on some of the initiatives of the National Garden Clubs, it was apparently not unusual for people in the mid-century to go out to public lands along roadsides and just cut down their Christmas tree, or cut up the toyon bushes and take all the berries and the holly and things home. So part of the purpose of this was to get people to look more responsibly on how they decorated, and to not undertake those activities on public lands, to be more responsible. Another popular event that was initiated early in the center history was the annual Easter egg hunt, and we see here that activity going on. It was sponsored by the Pixie Parents, who I'll talk about in just a minute. Another important function of the center, as I said earlier, was its memorial. It was its memorial function. Part of the idea behind creating these garden centers were to commemorate the war dead and important citizens in the community. You could create a memorial by purchasing or dedicating an existing tree or plant in the name of a particular individual. There were trees that were planted specifically as memorials, and in some cases, entire garden installations, and then some simpler memorials such as hardscape items like benches and placards that were created in the garden. This center one where they are planting a tree is kind of interesting. This is a dawn redwood that they're planting, and probably you all know, you're probably more aware than most people, there are only 3 species of redwoods, 2 of which are native to America, and this dawn redwood, which grows in China. And so the center actually, this memorial actually brought a dawn redwood to the garden and planted it. Over here is a map which records all of the memorials that have been created at the center. The home, as I said, the center provided a home for many organizations. For the arts, as you can see here, is a gallery show centered in this building, which was the first of the modern buildings built on the property. They were both professional and amateur level artists that were here. You see here a group, jury, board members, and the arts organization jurying a show. They were very selective about what they showed in the gallery, and also at their annual gallery, large art sale event at the fairs. Again, the people who were the linkage between the arts community in Marin and San Francisco and the center, you again see Jose Moya del Pino and his very, very, I think, glamorous wife, Helen Horst Moya, who was a native Marin, who was from here. You see up on the other side, this is the building we're now sitting in. This was, as I say, the first building built in the modern period by the board and designed by, as I think Antonio pointed out, by Gardner Daly. The theater was represented by the Ross Valley Players, and you see here the barn, when it was kind of rather completely revised to provide a long-term theater. You see one of the players' many posters, and their logo, and they still are operating. They've been here. They've actually started performing in the barn before it became the art center. So they are one of the longest participating members of the Art and Garden Center. Just do this really quickly. Again, these are examples of the auxiliary groups that form themselves. This is the antique shop, which again still operates today to help the center. Another version of the Decorations Guild. Over here, this is a fashion show, which fashion shows and luncheons, which began to be sponsored by an auxiliary group called the Northgate Group, who helped to provide substantial funding for the center. And many of these groups began to need purposely built buildings to help facilitate what they were doing. Here you see the Northgate building, which is still standing, where they had a large kitchen out of which they were able to do these events, which were, as you can see from that slide, very, very popular. Another very important auxiliary group at the center was the Pixie Playground. It first came together as a group of parents who, basically found a babysitter to keep the kids while they were doing things at the center, either attending events or working at the center. But in 1952, it became a more organized group. The AAUW, the American Association of University Women, again, women doing things. At this time, the AAUW was helping to build playgrounds in parks all over the country, and they came together here to sort of, if you will, organize and sponsor the playground in a more formal way. The woman in this corner is Elizabeth Twilliger. She was a big educator in Marin, a conservationist, a gardener, and she played this very important role very early in Marin in getting environmental and conservation programs into the Marin schools. And she was very active in the center here. She had lots of nature things with kids in conjunction with the playground. What?
Very active in MCL.
Yeah. Again, it's that overlap of people who are involved in these groups. So there is this synergy among all of this. The AAUW, or the Pixie Parents, with sponsorship of the AAUW, hired a professional landscape architect to redesign the playground. And you see here, at least, they hired Robert Royston, a very famous Bay Area landscape architect, and these are some of the modernist play structures he designed. And then here you see this very modest building that was built as and placed at the playground, provided an indoor space for children to play in inclement weather. And that was donated by Sephora Evers as a memorial, under the memorial program, as a memorial to her son who died in World War II. The center initially made great use of the small number of facilities that were here, the barn for the theater group, the octagonal building, which had several different, they redid and rethought the interior of what was originally the well house several times. It was finally moved a few feet from its original location, and it is downstairs as the Memorial Library on the grounds. And right in front of that is the Gladys Smith, one of the very active Marin garden people, and someone who worked in the garden constantly here. She was probably responsible for refurbishing the garden every spring and making sure that everything, that the garden looked its best. This is the fountain that was installed as a memorial to her. And then during the very first few years, there were these kind of the structures and buildings that just sort of occurred in conjunction with some of the events. One of the most charming and lovely is this bottle house, which is a little structure that is built with bottles, as its name implies. And the amphitheater began its life in this way and then was later made more formal by the architects who worked here. But there was, as I say, this growing need for more facilities, and what occurred was the board looked for for some people to assist them in how to develop the site and how to meet the needs of the many groups here. And they turned to this group of just emerging and very well-known and respected architects that pioneered modernist architecture in the Bay Area. These included, at the top, you see Thomas Church, and I would say these people were starting to be known in the Bay Area. They're now nationally and internationally famous people for their contribution to architecture. That's Thomas Church standing there. I love this picture. This is Don Ammons of Worcester Bernardi and Evans, one of the most prominent modernist architectural firms of the period. And I can't help but look at that photograph and think of the program Mad Men. He's there in his drawing board in a shirt and tie with a cigarette in his hand. It's just very good. And this is Gardner Daly with glasses on, and Robert Royston on the other side. So these are the well-known architects who helped to really put their stamp on the center and build the facilities that largely continue to occur here. There you see some of the purpose-built buildings that they designed. We've already looked at the gallery where we are now, the Livermore Pavilion, and here at the North Gate Center that served the auxiliaries purposes. And then initially, let me flip this back quickly. Initially, the person who took the lead here was Thomas Church, and he worked very closely with in the first years of the center, helping them to decide how to utilize the space that was here. And Church became so busy, and unfortunately not much remains. We don't really have any plans of what he recommended. But in his place, Worcester Bernardi and Ammons stepped forward. And what you see here is their plan for this, their plan for the center, not all of which was realized. There are buildings that they proposed that never got built. Probably in one way, their primary impact was to place all of the buildings kind of in one small area and site them along the creek, something you could never do today. And to formalize the parking lot area so that it was separated from the garden and more formally kept out of the way. By the 1970s, almost all of the site had been developed, and what you see now, this is all what was developed during that period, and pretty much the site retains the major features that were installed in this area. The last thing to be built here was the serpentine wall, which separates the center from Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, and creates this kind of feeling of separation and peace and quiet that the center has, even though it exists along one of the busiest transportation routes in the county. The gates were designed by Herman Hine, who was a member of the board, to provide finally a formal entrance into the center. So that's sort of it, to just give you an idea of what happened here.
Carol, thank you so much. That was not only most interesting, but historically grounding, while I think inspiring us forward about what we can do together. It's not about I, it's about us these days, right? We have lots of dessert left, and we invite you to help yourself to dessert. What, Vicki?
Can I just say, we have Fran Capoletti here from the Roth Historical Society.
Oh!
We've got 2 interesting facts about the center, about
Do
the,
you have time? I thought.
quickly, about the walls, and maybe something that's on site from Helen Van Pelt.
Oh, thank you.
If you're interested in seeing these pictures close up, please let me know. Vicki's been a great help, and I'd love to see that you're hearing this story and seeing the story. But the brick walls are in honor of Mrs. Livermore from her son, and they use 1 layer of bricks, so they have to be curvy so it doesn't fall down. But it's a great tribute, and it came from an old building in the city being torn down. So think of reuse and recycle back in 1968. And then the butterfly cottage over here was Helen Van Pelt's shed. She donated to the center, and it's moved around over the years. It's been an antique shop and a storage shed and the butterfly cottage today. So those
And
are just.
where is the, where
It's going to
is
be out by the tree out as you go toward the parking lot.
okay, thank you,
So
Fran. Vicki.
enjoy this and the center and all that is here that they preserved for you to see.
Thank you so much. I neglected to thank Susan Stomp for the lovely flowers. And we just, again, want to thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for your support of Marine Conservation League. Have a great rest of the day.